Right, good evening. I take it you can all hear me. Thanks for inviting me to speak this evening. Thanks to SOS for helping fund this project. You'll find out more about that shortly. So for some years, we've been studying Greenshanks in the Solent. It's a species of wading bird, breeds largely in the far north and winters further south, as you'll find out. So the Farnham Marine Group have been involved with this project for some time. I'd like to dedicate this talk this evening to my dear friend, Dr. Roberts, Theo Roberts on the left, who actually was instrumental in me taking up bird ringing, largely. He and his son, Graham. Theo would have been 97 today, but sadly passed away a few days ago. And on the right, you've Barry Watson, your president of past days. I think vice president now. But Barry trained me to canonet birds. I've been a good friend for 40 years. So without these two gentlemen, I probably wouldn't be putting this talk together tonight. So thank you very much. I'm dedicated to both of them. On we go. Greenshanks then, where do you find them? The yellow areas are where they breed. So northern Scotland, right through Scandinavia into Russia. There's some in Belarus and those sort of areas. And they winter in the blue areas. And the western sort of population head west to the Atlantic coast, wintering in Ireland, southern Britain, and into West Africa, as you can see. Now, I'm going to try this. You might hear this in a sec. This is a song of a greenshank. Not the most attractive song in the world, but there we go. I once heard it at Thorney Deeps. And this is the call, which you're probably more familiar with. Great birds, great call. I love that call, my favorite call. So where do you find them? Well, this is where they're breeding in these desolate sort of areas up in the northern Scotland, Sutherland, Caithness, in the flow country. But they do nest in areas with more scrub and trees. I've seen them nesting in not far from woodlands in Norway, and adult birds standing on top of trees, alarming at chicks, or rather alarming at me. So here's a greenshank sat on a nest in Norway, in Scotland. I didn't take the picture myself, I'm afraid. I think it's from the Nethersold Thompson family who sent it to me. They often nest somewhere like next to an old stump or a bit of an old fence post or a couple of rocks. A feature they like to nest next to. And you see the dark feathers on the background, at the back of the bird, the mantle. This is summer plumage. You can see how it camouflages with the mosses and what have you there. We don't often see them in that plumage in the Solent. Attractive birds. I did go up there and help with this project with the people in Scotland for a long weekend, and we did manage to catch this bird on a nest and colouring. It's the first colouring in Scotland in recent years. And then it turned up, would you believe, on the Stour Estuary on the Essex-Suffolk border, and was photographed there, and it's been there for a number of winters, and it breeds in Scotland. Rather nice result. This book, Greenshanks by the Nethersold Thompsons, is what you need to read if you're interested in greenshanks, written in 1979. Huge amount of information, especially about breeding biology. So they breed in variable densities. They lay 4 eggs usually. They start incubating them in Scotland around the 6th of May. Incubation takes 24, 25 days to the eggs hatch. And if you're a successful chick, you'll fly in 25 days. And that's it, off to the coast. So where do you find them? There's about 1,500 pairs in the UK, all in Scotland, pretty much. Small population compared with Scandinavia and Western Russia. You notice the Russian population is a bit of a guesstimate. So anyway, quite a number. So in the UK, this is from BTO Bird Track, thanks to Graham Appleton, who sent me this through. You get these graphs from Bird Track. You can see in the spring, we get a small migration through at the end of April, early May, birds heading back north. And then there's a big peak in the autumn when the birds finish breeding and juveniles come to the coast. And then there's a smaller number wintering around the coast of the British Isles. So where do you find them in the autumn? Mainly from the Wash down to the Solent. They've all got numbers on there, which tells you roughly how many there were around that time. So we're a pretty important spot, the Solent, Chichester and Langston Harbour. And in the winter, they go further west. In the UK, they winter from the Solent really down to Devon and Cornwall, South Wales, and there's a lot in Ireland. There's around just over 2,000 wintering in Britain and Ireland around the coast, most of them in Ireland. Of course, this talks about local things really, but this is the Solent. Many of you probably know it. So I've spent a lot of my life between Portsmouth, Langston, Chichester harbours since the mid-70s. And we've been running the Greenshanks project in Langston Harbour and in Chichester Harbour. Most of them come through in the autumn. You see the graph in the bottom right gives some numbers from almost 20 years ago from Chichester Harbour. Over 160 birds at that point, roosting at Thorney Deeps. It's a lot lower these days. There's also a wintering population, smaller numbers, and increasing over at Lymington Key Haven. There's some pictures I took from the plane on the way back from Portugal. This is Langston Harbour, Portsmouth on the left, Hayling Island in the foreground. So Farmington Marsh and the islands in the middle of the picture, just below the motorway. Good spot for Greenshanks for roosting and all the channels where they feed in the autumn. Not many in the winter. This is Sware Deep, the top of Hayling Island. You can see the motorway winding its way through. And you've got Emsworth there and Thorney Island in the foreground. So a bit of water, the harbour west of Thorney Island is very important for Greenshanks and Redshanks. So the birds feed in these channels and then come back over the seawater roost on the deeps as the tide rises. And here's a bit more of Thorney. I was lucky to get these pictures. So you can see the old tidal creek running through Thorney Deeps there. So that the Shanks come in from the east and the west onto the deeps to roost and then disperse out again. And then they get back into places like this. This is Emsworth Harbour at low tide, a spot where Anne de Potier and people like Brian Fellows and Barry Collins have spent a lot of time ring reading here for Greenshanks and black-tailed goblets, and myself occasionally. Good spot. So why study Greenshanks? Almost said goblets. Well, we realised we were ringing most of them in the Britain and Ireland, over 40% a year on average. So we thought we ought to try and do something about it. And I've been to a lot of these BTO conferences and several people were starting to colouring birds in the 90s. And I thought we should do the same. So we did. And we've ringed almost 900 Greenshanks. We've had quite a number of retraps. That gives us lots of information on weights and molt. We started colour ringing 30 years ago. We've colour ringed over 500. And they've generated over 5,000 sightings, largely due to local observer effort. And we've done a lot of mist netting at Farlington over the years. And if you plot the numbers caught per week against date, number against date, you get these sort of bimodal distribution really of both adults, which are in red. And so you've got a peak in early August and then another peak in September. And we think it's the females coming through first and males later, which quite a number of waders do this. They leave the males with the chicks. I've read it somewhere that Greenshanks do this. Well, Netherthorpe Thompson doesn't mention it. Spotted Redshanks are renowned for it. And the greener juveniles coming later. So at Thorney, we've worked very closely with Chichester Harbour Conservancy and the MOD there and the tenant farmer. This is us processing a group of Greenshanks on a hot day. So over a 15-year period, we've ringed 250 there. 80 of them were in one catch, the biggest UK catch ever of this species. And we spent a lot of time here ring reading, especially Anne and Barry. And I've done some supplementary recording there to help them out. Great spot. So to do this, we've used cannon nets. We've set them on the edge of the deeps. You can see Anne has gone out, usually Anne, looking to see where these birds are roosting. And we established which through the bank they might be on. And there's a lot of the deeps. And then we set these long nets, they're 26 meters long, and dig some cannons into the ground and hope the birds come and land there. A lot of sitting and standing around doesn't always work, especially when the cows chew through your cable. That's a net hidden with some grass quite close to the edge of the deep. Has to be close because they're fast flyers and outfly the net otherwise, as we found out in the early days. Chichester Harbour Conservancy staff, people like Anne and Ed, Pete now, Keith and Georgie have been great over the years, helping us out, as has the farmer, Simon. And when we've had success, the birds are taken out of the nets, put into these keeping cages, and then they're aged. The wings and the heads of bills are measured. and we weigh them and record their mold and put colour rings on them. Big team effort, need a lot of people for this. And we're trying aging these birds is not always easy. The top left bird is an adult that's not molting. The one to its right is an adult that is molting, as you'll see. And birds have to molt their feathers once a year, otherwise they wear out. They replace all their feathers. And the bottom left one is the one that's almost finished. And the bottom right one is a juvenile. They don't molt with us. And the tails are quite interesting patterns. The adults are on the left, and the juveniles have this more stripy tiger stripes of tail on the right. This is an adult that's not molting. There's two groups of adults, those that molt and those that don't. And there aren't that many that don't molt, but we think these birds go on quite quickly. They put a lot of fat on feeding in the harbours and then go on down into Africa, and they molt when they get there. Whereas these birds, which molt with us, they might molt some of the primary feathers and then they stop and migrate, or they might molt the whole lot and then migrate, or they just winter with us like that. But anyway, interesting stuff. So we looked at weights of birds. Juveniles consistently, that's the green line, are consistently lighter by date than the adults. The red line are adult birds that are molting. You see as the months go on, the weeks go on, they get fatter. A lot of these birds are going to head off to winter, probably in Africa, and they need the fat for migration. And the birds that don't molt at all are always the heaviest birds. And then when the bottom graph shows you birds that we've caught twice in the same autumn. It shows progression of weight, increase of weight. This is in grams. Some of them put on weight quite quickly, others don't. We measure bills and various things with these birds, but it's just classic standard normal distribution with Greenshanks, unlike black-tailed godwits and curlews or other species like dunlins. So we can't sex them on bill length. But what we did do was collect some feathers under license, and Hazel Watson from Bath University analysed them for us, and quite a good sample size. The only thing we found that was useful was the wing seems to be, the females are a bit bigger, the wings are a bit longer. And I did read somewhere else more recently that somebody's discovered the tails are longer on females. There we go. So what are we, some basic stuff. 75% of all the birds we've colour ringed have been seen again. That's pretty outstanding. 50% of over 50 birds have been seen outside our study site. We hold the record for the longest lived Greenshank, that's 16 years since ringing. And apparently we hold the 3rd, 4th and 5th oldest ones as well. There we go. Netherthal Thompson only got one up to 13 years old on their study site in Scotland, but the Dutch smashed it all and they got one at 23 years old. Astonishing. But we do have a red shank in Langston Harbour at 21 years old. There you go. So where are they seen? Once we colour ring these birds, what happens to them? In the autumn, most of our sightings are around the Channel coast, one or two down into Spain. Then in the winter, they go further west and further south, as you might imagine. And in the spring, more of a scattergun approach, but more birds heading east through Europe, up through Italy, Germany, heading north via an easterly route back out of North Africa or West Africa, wherever they're going, back to Scandinavia. But we've also got some there, one in Wales, one up in Scotland. Interesting. This was really quite an exciting email to open. Somebody was in Knockshot in Mauritania and spotted this greenshank running around a pond with colour rings on, and it was a bird that ringed 4 weeks earlier at Farrington Marsh, Portsmouth. And that's almost 4,000 kilometres south, 2,400 miles. According to Google, that's 57 hours by car. I wouldn't want to drive it. Anyway, so this is just a combination of all of our sightings and recoveries on the same map. So blue is one that's been seen, and red is a bird that's been found, usually dead. I'm afraid all the ones on the French coast were shot. French don't seem to be shooting them now, but they shot a lot in the 70s and 80s. And that's all the Farrington Ring Group ones in red, with all the other national ones from the BTO archive put on one map. So we've actually produced a lot of them. And the colour ring reading in that around the harbours, various people have done a huge amount. At Farrington, the warden there, or the ex-warden, Bob Chapman, Chris Coburn and Jason Crook, recorded many rings there over the years, along with a number of other people. And in Chichester Harbour, Anne and top right and Barry Collins here have done a lot of ring reading over the years, along with Brian Fellows and the late Nick Humphreys. Peter Raby and Ruth Croger and many others, over 30 years, been recording these rings. And thank you to all the observers that reported colouring birds, and please carry on doing so. So a few little stories about some of the birds we've ringed. This is green yellow, green yellow. We got 12 years worth of information from this bird, or was it 13? Almost 250 sightings, and always feeds in Nutbourne freshwater outlet, east of Thorney. Pretty impressive, always in the same channel. This bird here was ringed at Thorney in the autumn, and then moved across to Brittany, southwest Brittany, and the picture on the top right is Brittany, and that's the same bird on the left and the right. So Thorney Island on the left, Brittany on the right, there till the end of March, regularly reported over 3 winters. And then on one of the springs, look at this, it then head off up into halfway up Norway. It was there between the 7th and 8th of May, and it's photographed again, running around on a mudflat, waiting to go inland. This is fantastic. These maps have been produced by Nick Goldsmith, especially for this talk for you. So thank you to Nick. Another interesting greenshank, one that I think we ringed at Farlington initially, it became a thorny bird. But every year, just after Christmas, around New Year, the end of December, it would migrate from Langston, Chichester Harbour to northern Spain. And it would stay there till the middle of April. For 3 years running this happened, and then it would go back to Thorney Island. Barry Collins would see it there till early May, and then it would migrate presumably off to Scandinavia. And this chap Pueblo was reporting them each year and saying it's back on its rock. Here's another photograph. I've had a whole series of photographs of this bird. Lovely. And this other one, not such a nice tail. It was ringed at Farlington in 1991. We retrapped it and colour ringed it at Thorney in 2002. We knew nothing about it at that point. Then we realised it was wintering on the Hamble every year until early May. And unfortunately, in May 2004, it migrated up to the White Sea, spotted by a Russian researcher who shot it. But it remains the only ring of recovery in Russia of a British ring greenshank. And we had a really nice project with Chichester Harbour, the ring group, and Chichester Harbour Conservancy, called Rhythms of the Tide, of which we were part, which was Greenshanks, the migration story. And you can read more about it on the website there, greenshank.info, funded by the lottery. And they helped pay for a radio tracking project, which is here. We tagged some birds with radio track to see what was happening at night in the harbours and how long they were staying. But unfortunately, as we're tagging birds with molting, most of these tags fell off quite quickly. So we got limited information, but we did learn things like this. In other words, where they were seen, all the little coloured birds or different birds. The most interesting thing I suppose we found, other than the fact they used the deeps at night, we had a data logger there recording them in and out, was they were going into Langston Harbour to an area you can't see from the shore, and then going back to Thorney or across to Farlington Marsh, and we discovered there was an interconnection between Farlington and Thorney Deeps. So going on to the Geolocated Project, which SOS have funded largely, we've got an increasing wintering population of greenshanks in Chichester and Langston Harbour SPA, and we're very curious as to know where they're from. Are they Scottish birds? Are they Scandinavian or whatever? We've got over 50% of all greenshanks in southeast England are actually in Langston Chichester Harbour, according to the BTO website. 40 years ago, the only information really on greenshanks wintering in the UK, according to Tony Prater, was one ringing recovery from 1926 in Cork, and it was assumed that all greenshanks wintering in the British Isles were from Scotland, especially as many of them had a departure date of late March, which is a good suggestion that there probably are. So maybe the increasing populations come from the east, I don't know. Anyway, so we fitted these birds with geolocators, a number of birds. We've actually put 17 tags out on 14 birds, on wintering birds. These are birds that we knew would be here because they're previously colouring them, or we caught them in the winter, so they would be their site faithful. So we had a good chance to catch them again. We had to take the tags off to plug them into a computer to get the data. Here's some of the results. It's quite exciting. This is what you get. Well, Josh Nightingale's done all this work with Ed Rousel using Flight R package. All the dark areas are actually, that's night. So what these tags do is they record dawn and dusk times. In the middle there is basically, this is a bird that's gone up into the high Arctic where there's no darkness in the summer. And the dark lines are actually where the bird's incubating, the up and down, above the sun. And those lines are actually correspond with 23 days, which is actually the time it takes for Greenshank to incubate its eggs. So that's interesting. Anyway, we get those little things, and then you somehow, not quite sure how Josh has done on this, you end up with these fantastic maps. This is where they went. So thanks to SOS, also British Birds and Hampshire Ornithological Society who funded these tags, mostly SOS. 2 have gone to Scotland and 7 have gone off to Scandinavia. The stars are where we think they're breeding, and the circles are where they stopped. We call staging sites en route. So we look at them individually as a group. These are the ones that went to Scotland. What we do know is from these tags is they were pretty much up there in 24 hours. We can't tell any more than that. Clearly the bird on the left, which is the picture on the left, wasn't nesting in the sea. These tags are not, they're not GPS tags. They don't give you precise locations. It was either in Shetland, possibly Orkney, or actually in Caithness. But that bird was usually last seen in the Solent up to the 17th of April, and then going up to Scotland. Most years it was earlier than that. And these are the ones that went to Norway, including the bird on the left there, which is the bottom right map. And that bird would stay with us until as late as the 4th of May, and then do this flight up into the high Arctic, really, to Lapland. As the geolocators showed, it stopped twice before it went up to its breeding site. So the green triangles are where it's staged. Most interesting, I suppose, is the top right one, which has got 3 dots, which we got 3 summers data from this bird. Clearly it didn't, I don't suppose, move around that much. It's just as these tags are not that accurate for the location, but it's in that area. Really exciting stuff, this. At least I think it is. And these are birds that have gone east of Norway. This is 2 into Sweden. And the top right bird, which is the picture, this one ended up in Russia, not far from the White Sea. It usually winters around Warblington, Langston Mill. You can see it there. I think it's still around. And that bird was staying with us till the end of April before it migrates. So what we thought we'd do was look at the dates of the known wintering birds, which is 40 more, and try and work out, extrapolate out how many of these are actually going to Scandinavia or Scotland. So the tags tell us 22% went to, okay, we only got a sample of 9, 22% went to Scotland, and 78% went east. Looking at this sort of cut-off of dates is a bit arbitrary. About 60% go off towards Scandinavia and Russia. But I'm not entirely sure we've got this right, but it's the majority seem to go to Scandinavia. But we do know from various papers, like Ron Summers' paper, most of them are back on the territories by the 7th of April in Scotland. So really the 19th of April, maybe a bit late for a cut-off. This is just a few little histories. This is one from, you'll find at the top of the Billy Line on Haley Island. It's there most days at the moment. Ringed at Thorney, as you can see, 2013. Winters North Hayling. Anne saw it on the 30th of March, 2017 at Thorney at the Roost. And then this following afternoon, it was in Inverness. That's 23 hours later, there it is running around on the mudflat. And last spring, on the 6th of April, it turned up in the West Midlands on Nature Reserve. It was a fantastic photograph, and from Chris Waring here. Obviously, it was a later spring last year because of the cold weather, so it left a bit later. There's another Scottish bird. This bird was ringed in Scotland on the Eithne Estuary by Raymond Duncan. It winters in Langston, Chichester Harbour. I saw it last week. It's a high tide roost at the Kench on Hayling. The latest date we've seen it in the spring is the 30th of March, which fits in with getting back to Scotland to breed. Whereas this guy that winters over at Norbarn, it's a famous Greenshank. It's even made the Hampshire Bird Report. I think we've had, I can't see, we've had a huge number of sightings of this bird. It's still around, it was seen the other day. Latest date, 23rd of April. So it's almost certainly going to Scandinavia, or maybe even into Russia. So what's the next stage of all this project? Well, we'd quite like to try some GPS tags. They are now available for things like Greenshanks or Redshanks, grey plovers. A lot of it's been done on the Tagus estuary in the last few winters. And you don't have to catch the bird. They report back to a data logger. So if you had a logger, say at the deeps at Thorney, and maybe one at Farlington, if the birds come within range, it's 100 meters or so from the logger, it downloads all its data and it gives you precise data within a meter. You can program them so that they get data every hour. These geolocators only give us information about when they change out of a certain area. It doesn't give any information about if it stayed for ages at one site. It won't tell you anything about how it's moved around the Solent or that type of thing. We don't know anything really much more about these birds that head south. It'd be nice to get some tags on those. Obviously, we need to fund a project like this because they're not cheap. But the big question mark must be really what's happening with the Devon and Cornwall wintering population. It's quite large. And there's probably, I don't know, there's 100 or more down there, or maybe a lot more. But they've never been ringed. I suspect most of them are from Scotland, but it might well be that quite a few of them are actually from Scandinavia. We do know that 1 or 2 of our birds, if not 3, we've ringed in Farlington at Thorney in the autumn, where they molted with us. They've ended up wintering near Kingsbridge, or one was on the Tortorridge estuary, and then heading back east in the spring. So maybe those are Scandinavian birds. But up until now, it's been assumed that they're all from Scotland. So we've done quite a bit else. Oh, I haven't been ended my talk at all. I've managed to inspire a lot of other ringing groups to start colour ringing these Greenshanks, and you can see what's happened here. Really, since the early 2000s, there's been a proliferation of projects. Quite a lot have been done, and there's some results coming up. So this bird was actually ringed in Scotland on the Eithne by Raymond, but it ended up wintering on Cape Verde, and it's been there for about 4 or 5 winters running. It was still there in 2018. Every winter it gets seen, often by tourists going there. It must be a good tourist destination. And these lovely photographs get sent through of this bird at Cape Verde, wintering. But does it breed in Scotland? It's been seen back in the spring on the Eithne, where it was ringed, between the 5th and 9th of May and the 3rd of May another year, and it's back there in early July. Ron Summers' paper in BTO Bird Study of 2020 is actually titled "Scottish Breeding Greenshanks Do Not Migrate Far," and their sample size was 6 geolocators and 10 colouring sightings for this paper. It may be that this is not a Scottish bird at all. Maybe it's coming via Scotland to go to Scandinavia, but unlikely, I think. But who knows? Interesting. But this is a really nice one. The Wash group has started colouring some for us, and this bird has gone for the Wash. We know it winters in Portugal on the Tagus at Seychelles, a site I know well, photographed there a couple of times. And in the spring, Emma Brenn saw this bird at Welney WWT on the Ouse Washes on the 4th of May, and then 5 days later it's seen and photographed in southern Norway. But then it heads up to the top of Norway to breed, being seen, and that picture on the left is actually on its territory, being photographed on the breeding site twice by different people. That's fantastic from one bird. Thank you. And this bird here we call Billy. Well, it's been called Billy. It's ringed by Bill Jones. It winters for the last 15 years at Cliff Marshes in Kent. Over 90 records of it. Stays to the 13th of May. Must be going a long way east. I even got an email back. You see the bottom one there? It says, "Billy is back." It's sent to me. Fantastic. And this guy from ringed by Mike Pratt and Mervyn on the Old, Aldborough in Suffolk, and then seen in northern Spain on the 7th of May. Cracking photograph. Probably going a long way north to breed. The Dutch know how to go at this as well. They've got a fantastic ringing site at Castricum. They sit outside in the sand dune on the edge of the North Sea, listen for waders migrating. The guy in the chair there calls out, "Greenshank coming." Guy inside the hut puts on a Greenshank tape lure. You can see the bottom, these 2 people here have got a little pool of water, big clap net. They put a decoy out there. This is like a stuffed bird. And then they pull a string from the hut if the bird lands, and they've caught a Greenshank, and then they're colouring them. Anyway, it's a huge amount of effort goes into all this projects. Loads of people involved. You can't do this on your own. Over many years, of course. The chap that runs Migrate Technology was really good, and he took some of these tags back. We couldn't download them, and downloaded them for us. All sorts of people involved. I just want to show you. So thank you to all of these folks. Quite a lot of people helped put this talk together, actually. There's a lot of effort in all this. So these people here, Barry and Margaret Collins. Barry worked for the Conservancy, was the ex-warden at Thorney Island, put a huge amount of effort in there over 40 years. I've actually known him since the 70s. Great recorder, fantastic field worker. Anne Watson and Barry, of course, and Robin Ward was coming down to help run catches from Cambridgeshire. Andrew Carter would come over from Salisbury. Andy Welch is an ecologist from Southampton, weighing a greenshank there. And Jenna, also from Portsmouth area. The late Nick Humphreys on the left, tragic loss to us all. Ran the data logger, fantastic field recorder, brilliant, really, really good chap. And the lady on the right, Ruth Croge, who's made all these colorings for these birds and helped organize all these catches. Fantastic stuff. Thank you. And I should leave you with a picture of a greenshank. I don't know where I got this from, but what a cracking photograph. And I would love to credit the photographer, but unfortunately I've lost the credit. But I thought I would share it with you anyway. So I think that's my talk over in record time. Yes, there you go. How about that?
Pete, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. To see them in the hand is just incredible, because they feel quite a large wader when you see them next to a dunlin or a ring plover, but to see how a hand almost wraps around the entirety of a greenshank is fascinating.
What a privilege that is.
Yeah. I take it you've handled many of those that have been.
Yeah, a few.
So if anybody would like any questions, pop them into the chat box and I'll field them as they come through. And thank you very much, Isabel, for starting the process off. In fact, Isabel's got 2 in there to get us going. So first one from Isabel is, has anything drastic changed since the Nether Souls book was published for the Greenshank? And Isabel,
that's a good question.
Yes, nice and broad.
Yeah, climate change. The winters are much warmer, of course, so many more birds are wintering with us. I don't know whether birds are arriving later in Scotland to breed. I don't think they are, from what I've been trying to find out. It very much depends on whether it's a cold spring or not, and they'll stay south before they get onto the breeding grounds, or they'll get up in the little estuaries nearby and feed up before they go onto the territories. But no, I don't know other than that. Climate change is obviously the big one.
In terms of population, how are they doing in the UK? Do we know both breeding and, obviously you've talked about the Cornwall and Devon.
The wintering population is increasing, we know that. The autumn population in the Solent is pretty static. It went up a lot, and I think it's dropping a little bit at the moment. There's possibly more staying on the East Coast or staying on the Dutch coast. I forgot to say that. 15,000 or more greenshanks are seen on the Dutch, German, Danish coast in the autumn. They don't come across to us, so we just get a fraction. And it's possible that more are staying across on that side. We have had 1 or 2 birds. For example, a Burby-ringed thorny, we've never seen back at Chichester Harbour, but every autumn is now seen on the Stour estuary, on the Essex-Suffolk water. And we do know that some birds change their patterns, and possibly with climate change, that they're changing their patterns. We know that some of the black-tailed goblets are, for example.
I'll take the next one from Isabel, which is, why do some people shoot the birds, such as the French one and the one that was in Russia?
Well, I have a lot of French friends, but they're not listening. I think a lot of it's done for fun, isn't it? I think, unfortunately, they don't seem to even think. Obviously, originally these people would have shot these things to eat, but I'm sure that it was done for more for fun these days, or it was. But in the case of the Russian bird, it was a Russian scientist, and I guess he just didn't realize he could. Well, maybe he didn't have a camera, maybe he didn't have a telescope, and he wanted to make to get the record for the scientific, get that specimen. And I've done a lot of expeditions to Iceland, and when I started going there, when would this have been, around 1999, they were still shooting rare birds when they turned up for the museum, which we had stopped doing 50 years earlier. So maybe Russia's, I don't know, part of Russia was a bit like that. I can't say any more than that. I don't know.
Indeed, yeah. Question from Ellie. Do you know what their nest survival is like in Scotland?
No, I don't. I don't. I feel I have absolutely. I can find out, but I have absolutely no information. There are a lot of these would be on keepered estates. They're probably quite good. probably dealing with the ground predators. But the problem is these birds nest at very low densities, and yes, certain pairs are monitored every year by a few dedicated people like Nick Christensen, who I was lucky enough to meet, and he showed us around. But I mean, most of the pairs, it's a lot of effort to do this. You know, it's a big hike into these valleys and on these big areas to find them, and probably nobody knows.
Okay, lovely. Next question. Why do they go back to the same place? And then why do they suddenly change their routes?
Well, many birds, especially with waders, are very site faithful on migration and wintering sites, and also on their breeding sites. And they just have these set patterns. They know where a good place is. I'm not sure about changing routes. I mean, some birds, they don't change routes that much. Some birds are going further east in the spring, probably because it's a quicker route back than following the coast back to Scandinavia. It's quicker to go across country and across the middle of Europe, if that's what the question is referring to. I'm not entirely sure about that.
Indeed. Okay, so do you know why? We obviously got to see some great maps of their distribution, particularly those coloured bird markings to show where they moved around Langstone and Chichester harbours. Do you know why there aren't any or a few in Bosham or Fishbourne?
Well, they are there. We went there to try and record radio tags and look for colourings, but it seems like the Thorny Roost doesn't support the Bosham to Fishbourne area, and there doesn't seem to be any interchange between. We've never had a colouring sighting over there. It's quite interesting because there's quite a few over at Fishbourne and some around Old Park Wood at Bosham, but these birds don't seem to be connected to the Thorny group.
That is intriguing, isn't it?
It's quite amazing.
Yeah. So close and yet so far.
Yeah, I showed you a picture of green, yellow, as we call it. Every single low tide period, it feeds in the same freshwater outlet into Chichester Harbour. The one at North Barn Woods there, it's always in that same channel, along with the spotted redshank that people go to photograph from all over the place. And these birds are real creatures of habit. It's astonishing. But of course, when they're molting, they get all gathered together in big flocks because they're probably more vulnerable because they have gaps in their wings. And they form these big flocks in August, September. And then in the winter, they're roosting in smaller groups, often in 1s and 2s, maybe up to 10 somewhere. Well, there aren't so many of them, but they disperse out is what I'm trying to say.
Brilliant. Graham Appleton, thanks you for the plug for Wader Tales blog. And he's popped into the chat for those who are interested, a link to the blog about the Scottish Greenshank paper, which is great. Lovely. Thanks, Graham. And he looks forward to being able to give your study the Wader Tales treatment.
Ah. Thank you, Graham. Thanks for logging in. I wasn't sure if you were going to.
From Isabel again, and we're getting plenty of questions coming in, which is fantastic. Hypothetically, if loads and loads more people recorded sightings, do you predict your data would change significantly?
Probably not on. A lot of these birds are seen regularly because they're the same birds, but it might change things a little bit if we got things like departure dates. The useful thing about having lots of repeat sightings of the same birds is we can actually start to build up a patterns of use, but also how long they live, survival, adult survival. And that's really quite key to monitoring what's going on with these populations. We haven't done a survival analysis yet. We've just been talking about it actually for the Greenshanks. A lot's been going on with black-tailed goblets and curlews and other species, but it would be good to do that. But we can only do that if we have lots of observations. So all these observations bird watchers send in by photograph or whatever, they're really useful. Of course, if they come with photos, that's brilliant. We can confirm the combinations because colour's not always easy to determine.
So the more the better, Pete.
The more the better, absolutely. Get out there, Isabel.
Val, hi Val. Is there much disturbance to the birds in the harbours, for example, from possibly increasing use of jet skis or powerboats?
I wouldn't think by those two methods. It's more likely to be dog walkers with loose dogs. I mean, disturbance of shorebirds is a bit of a moot issue. I mean, yes, it can be a problem where sites are really regularly hammered. Other sites, the birds just move on the coast a bit and move out, and then they just come back and they carry on. I don't think it's a major issue, but on some sites it certainly is. I don't think the Greenshanks I would consider to be a major issue at all. Not that I've seen, but there are many, many more people using the shore, you know, these days. So, yeah.
Lovely, and lots of projects that have to try and mitigate for that. From Brian Fellows, and maybe this has been in part answered, but Greenshanks seem very site faithful, Brian says, and feed with regular companions like, and I'm going to struggle to, G/GL, green over green,
yeah,
lime.
I know that. Yeah, that bird featured just now. That's Norbarn. That's one of Brian's regular birds. Yes.
What's GGL? Green.
Oh, it's green over red, lime, green, or something. I can't remember. Green over lime. Yeah, sorry, I can't see.
Good.
Yeah.
So Brian finishes that off with, "Is that usual?" And it sounds like it is very usual.
Well,
yes?
To have what companions, you mean?
To have this very site faithfulness and feeding with regular companions. So there's a 17-year spotted red shank there.
Yes, I think it seems to be that these birds are absolute creatures of habit. They definitely use the same areas, especially the wintering birds. I'm not so sure about the autumn birds; they're a bit more mobile. But Brian knows as well as I do. He's a fantastic observer and done dozens of years of this. And without him, we wouldn't have half of this data. He's just been a phenomenal force for good in Emsworth.
Fabulous, good stuff, Brian. Isn't it lovely to think they've got chums out there? It's fab.
Absolutely.
Dawn Barmer is in the call. Hi, Dawn. Are there any threats to the wintering population in Hampshire, such as development?
I don't think of Greenshanks. I mean, they're pretty scattered. There are around nature reserves. Mostly, Chester Harbour is relatively rural still. I don't think so. I don't think any of the roosting sites or the feeding sites are threatened. The main threat would be increased disturbance, I guess. Yeah, sorry, Dawn, I can't give you I'm glad I can't say that.
No, that's nice to have a positive message about one species, at least, given how many are threatened by development and other factors. Isabel's back in, talking about green, yellow, loving nut-borne food. And is asking, what do they eat? But before you answer that, she does come in on the next thing to say that she's your stepdaughter and super interested.
Well, that's the Isabel, is it? I thought it might be. What do they eat? Right, they're eating very small fish, a little small fry, very small fish, but also crustaceans, things like shrimps. Yeah, gammarids. Yeah, so they're basically dashing about in these channels, getting they can get hold of, really, but they're definitely not eating mollusks. So it's small fish, not small fry. Yeah,
the kind of stuff that we
small fry.
We'd struggle to see unless you really were close and with a telescope. Little stuff.
I did once catch one that coughed up 2 small fish, which I think I've still got in my freezer. I thought I'd keep those one day and get them analysed. I never did. I must get them out.
Isabel keeps going. Isabel, why do they die? Is there a range of reasons, or are there super common reasons?
Probably old age, I think, with a lot of these waders. We had very few ringing recoveries. As I said, most of them have been, unfortunately, the ones that have been reported by the BTO have been shot, or we had one found dead, just a leg, I think it was, at Langston. There's more predators these days. Things like peregrines would be a big threat to them, and maybe sparrowhawks. I've not seen any predation of the species at all. Other than that, I don't know. Other than things we don't really know much about, there's probably an element of pollution things going on these days. With we know some really interesting work been going on looking at shrimps around Portsmouth. The Portsmouth University been working on. I saw a nice paper there suggesting that a lot of these shrimps were becoming almost infertile, and some of the worms there, and the populations of these things are dropping near sewage outfalls. And of course, if there's problems with the food supply, there's going to be problems with the birds. But I mean, it's a bit of a tenuous link, but I don't think it's that tenuous. It just needs investigating.
Okay, brilliant.
I'm not the man for the job. Can't do everything.
What can we do to help the greenshank apart from getting out, observing and reporting? Anything else?
Good question. I don't know, be a member of various conservation organisations, you know, promote these things to walkers and you know, the general public, increase awareness, not disturbing the birds at high tide on roost sites. I don't know what more I could say really for Greenshanks specifically. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that.
No, that's great. Thanks, Pete. From Colin Brooks, do any birds which subsequently pair appear together in winter in Sussex?
No. As far as, well, I don't know about that for the Sussex ones because we haven't got the information. Nobody's been to the breeding grounds and done them. But the people that have worked on the breeding grounds, the Netherthall Thompsons, for example, and Ron Summers, Nick Christensen's work, Brian Etheridge, we do know that the females, I think I remember saying the females winter further south and the males are further north. They don't winter as a pair. It's the same as the black-tailed godwits, the birds we've marked in Iceland as a wide team. These birds do not winter together. They don't stay as a pair, not like geese or swans, but they do arrive back within a few days of each other. We do know for black-tailed godwits and with Greenshanks, I've read up on this, and they're back together within 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 days, and you know, they migrate from quite different places, but end up back together on the same territory. Great stuff.
Elliot Chander asks, are there theories about why females have longer wings and tails? Do they migrate further? Well,
I just alluded to the fact that there's some suggestion that some of the females, if I've read that correctly and recall it correctly, that these females go a little bit further south, but not much. It's possible, but I'm not sure. But then a lot of waders, the females are bigger. Curlews, for example, black-tailed godwits. But I'm not entirely sure, but with curlews, longer bills, that we know that they can go perhaps more successfully inland feeding in the winter. No, I've got the wrong way around. Curlews stay on the mudflats. They have longer bills and get to the worms, which the males can't reach. That's the theory of that paper that came out. Probably the same with godwits. But I couldn't tell you. There's not a huge difference with Greenshanks. It's marginal.
Interesting. Okay, and our final comment, it looks like before we close, is actually from Anne de Potier, who we saw earlier in the presentation. So it appears that all the Greenshank champions are in on the call today, which is fantastic. And Anne's point is that she thinks the thorny roost is particularly safe, in inverted commas, because it's within the SPA, the Special Protection Area, on either private farmland or on the military base at Thorney. So Anne's view is that she thinks the main threats are climate change and sea level rise, or if the military left Thorney.
Very well said, Anne. I must say a big thanks to Anne de P for managing the colouring database for the last, I don't know, seems like 20 years. But she's done a fantastic job and she liaises with all the observers. So thank you, Anne.
Brilliant. So I'm going to conclude with a little question of my own to you, Pete, which is, it sounds like you store in your head the names of some, not just Billy, but like the green, yellow, green, and is that right? Could you actually name some of these Greenshanks?
Do I have to give you an honest answer?
You do. You do.
Well, yes, I can't help it. You get very attached to some of these birds and you get to know them individually, but also you get to remember them from their colouring combinations, as I'm sure some of the Godwit team, who sounds like they're listening in, do exactly the same, and you can't help it. It makes it more personal, and you get more out of it.
Indeed. I won't go further and ask which colour combination is your favourite, because that'd be like asking you to pick between your children. I know. So, Pete, fantastic. That was really fascinating. For not only because of what
it reveals. Red, yellow.
Oh, you have got a favourite. Ah, okay. And you've got John Curtin coming in saying thanks everyone for such a wonderful project. John loves reporting Greenshank that he sees off of Thorney, and I think the hope is after this that many more folk will when they're out and about. So fantastic, Pete. It's always sad that on a call like this we can't hear the applause, but I can hear it virtually going on out there for you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Right, here we go. Green Sandpipers. It's actually a great pleasure to talk about Green Sandpipers. I've not done a talk on them for 10, 15 years now. but with a group of Hertfordshire ringers, Barry Trevis and Mike Reed there, we actually started studying green sandpipers in Hertfordshire in the mid-1980s, 1983. And we were just three middle-aged ringers in those days, and now we're three old-age ringers still studying the same bird. So this all started in Hertfordshire. It would be great to say we had an amazing sort of conservation interest when we started, but it was pretty opportunistic, really, that the opportunity was there to ring some green sandpipers, and we've then developed that into a study that's really shown some fantastically interesting things about them. Hertfordshire has a bit of a tradition of ringers studying green sandpipers, because Tom Kittle, who sadly died a few years ago, studied green sandpipers in the 70s in Cambridgeshire, and he had a paper on them, on the molt strategies and their weights, that was published in the very first edition of Ringing and Migration, which is the journal that ringers publish all their stuff in. So there we go. And he was studying them on a watercress bed in Cambridgeshire. Right, a few things about green sandpipers. They have a massive world distribution. So this is from Birds of Western Palearctic, so it stops, the breeding distribution in red there stops at the boundary of the Western Palearctic. It actually goes right across Eastern Palearctic as well. And so they breed in the boreal forests, and then they leave there in winter and go south, all the way south into India and Africa. You can see the grey here, a few winter in Britain, and the rest of Western Europe, most of them carry on through. So in Britain, it's an extremely rare breeding bird. So I've actually got the BTO Atlas maps here, and it's fascinating when you look at them. So the breeding map on the left there, the two red dots here are actual breeding records of green sandpipers. So a few pairs, the odd pair, breeds up in the Highlands each year, and that seems fairly stable, just the odd ones. The interesting thing on the Atlas map is all these black dots, and these are green sandpipers that recorded during the Atlas breeding season fieldwork, but there's no way they were breeding. They were birds that were still there at the end of winter, and so the Atlas fieldwork was starting in April, and that says actually a lot about what I'm going to tell you later about what they're doing. So they're still around in April, so we've got the black dots. Amazing thing for a wader, not only do they perch in trees, but they actually nest in them. So they nest in old thrush nests, usually, in trees in the boreal forest zone. And then their chicks just leap out once they've hatched, and off they go. So a bit like ducklings leaping out of nest holes. On the right here, we have the wintering distribution, and they're pretty thinly distributed, wintering in much of Britain. If you look carefully, the dots on the wintering distribution are pretty similar to the dots on that April records from the breeding one. So they're scattered through the lowlands. And there's lots of similarities here with Greenshanks. So this is the Migration Atlas map showing the ringing recoveries for green sandpipers. And so essentially they're usually migrating through Britain on this southwest route down the edge of Europe. At the time of doing the Atlas, there was one record up here which could be related to them breeding. A lot of records moving on, and then the odd ones in France. So some of the key things about green sandpipers, the first thing is they're a very small wading bird. So some of you were surprised how small Greenshank is in the hand. Well, a green sandpiper is about the size of a song thrush. That really is a very small bird. And for most bird watchers, it's quite a challenge. They're seen, but they're usually seen as they're flying away. So they're very shy birds. Usually the first you know of them is one flying away. You very rarely get to look at them actually behaving. They only occur inland, so very rarely on estuaries and tidal sites. I don't know what the Webb's counts is about 100 or something recording in any of the birds of estuary counts. In winter, they're normally in 1s and 2s, and you don't get any big flocks in winter at all. In terms of their timing when they're around, lots of similarities with the Greenshank. They're in Britain for every month of the year, except May. There's a few records in May, and this is the only Sussex connection in the talk. I've actually used the records submitted to Sussex Bird Report for 2019, just to look at the annual pattern of occurrence. And this is typical, and you get exactly the same in Hertfordshire and many other lowland counties. Small numbers through the winter, some evidence of a bit of a peak in April, which would be birds migrating north, virtually none in May, then birds reappearing in June, and then big peak in August through July to September, and that will be birds coming back plus young birds of the year joining in, and then back to the low numbers through the winter. So there we have higher numbers during passage. And what I want to do this evening is to use our studies and what we found to try and answer why some of these things were on. So why are they like this? What's it all about? So the study itself is mainly focused on this lovely little nature reserve in Hertfordshire called Lemsford Springs. It's owned and managed by the Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust, and it was actually a watercress bed originally, which then went out of business and was acquired by the trust as a nature reserve in the early 1970s. So it has, and there's a photograph of it here. The River Lee flows beside it, and then these beds here are spring-fed, and there are artesian wells as well to the boreholes to bring the water in to feed spring water in that was used for growing watercress. Some of you have probably driven past Lemsford Springs loads of times because that is the A1M heading that way north. So it's only about 200 yards from the very busy road. It's managed by volunteers and the Wildlife Trust staff. It's fresh water, so it doesn't freeze in winter. And one of the key things about it is access is limited. This is really important. We don't want to ban people from places, but if people go to Lemsford Springs, they have to follow the rules, which implies not disturbing the birds on the lagoons. Without that control, I'm sure we wouldn't have the numbers of birds we have. And so here's a picture of the lagoon, so shallow, flowing spring water over a gravel bed. Water depth is perfect for these sandpipers, an inch or two, some deeper bits. Over the summer, watercress and other aquatic plants grow over the summer. And a great feature for us in terms of studying our birds is there are hides that overlook the reserve. And so since 1983, when we started, we've ringed over 200 green sandpipers at Lemsford Springs, plus about 74 have been ringed elsewhere in Hertfordshire by us and other Hertfordshire ringers who've got roped into the project. And we've colouringed all those. So the original idea was let's colouring them, because when we started, nobody even got any idea whether it was the same birds coming back from one year to the next or whatever. And it's quite difficult to know the true total, but I did a bit of a back of the envelope, and I think we've probably had over 20,000 resightings of these colouring birds. And there's one there on the left, yellow on blue, just hunched there by one of the walls in the crest beds. And here's Barry Trevis, one of the ringers, who spent a lot of time with his telescope in the hides recording these birds. So it's a fantastic record. How do we trap the birds? So this is actually quite interesting because we had to learn a bit about the ecology to even get to trap them, because they're pretty shy birds and not many are ringed each year in the UK. Initially, we trapped them in mist nets set over the lagoons, and we set the mist nets before first light, and we found that the birds were actually arriving at first light onto the lagoon, so we had a chance of catching them in a mist net. Here's one in the mist net here with Barry taking it out. So that's interesting itself. So the birds actually weren't on the watercress bed at night. They'd obviously gone off somewhere else to roost. In recent years, we've moved more to catching them with spring traps like this one. So this is a spring trap on adjustable feet, so you can adjust it to be just above the water level. And the net fires over the birds. Now, you wouldn't fire the net with 5 individual birds on it, but these are remotely controlled. And they have a couple of great advantages. The first thing is that you can actually select the bird you want to catch. And in many cases, we wanted to particularly catch individual birds that we knew about. And also, of late, and this will be interesting for people in Sussex, there's been such an invasion of ringneck parakeets in Hertfordshire that actually, if you're not careful, they fill up your mist net at first light, and that then prevents you catching any green sandpipers. So what have we learned? Well, we published quite a few papers on this, but the first thing that came out was a paper on habitat usage and return rates of wintering birds from one year to the next at Lemsford. And this was a graph in the original paper. And so the annual return rate of colouring birds was anywhere from 100% down to 80. So the average was about 85% were coming back to the same site from one winter to the next. So at the time, that was new information. That's phenomenal, really, this return rate. What we plotted here is actually the annual return rate versus the days of air frost. And this was actually done in the late 1980s. And some of you have been around for a bit will remember we used to have cold winters in those days. And it's pretty clear that these birds were surviving less well in really cold winter conditions. And by really cold, I mean that with everywhere frozen, except possibly Lemsford Springs. So that was quite a big effect going on there. But the other thing we found out from ringing these birds was actually they have a repertoire of local sites over the course of the year. And I've spent a decade of my life trying to read the rings on the legs of green sandpipers. Now, those of you who know about green sandpipers will know that actually they're much better at seeing you than you are at seeing them. So actually finding out where they were and then working out a way to approach without disturbing them to get a look at their legs was quite a challenge. But over the decade, you could work it out. And so every month of the year, I tried to look at all our local sites for these colouring birds. And so here's a map of mid-Hertfordshire. So Welwyn Garden City is where I live. This is the A1 coming up here. And so this is about 10 miles by 10 miles. This was the local area that we searched over this period, over the 83 to 91. And all the red marks are where we found green sandpipers. And so Lemsford Springs is here, and there's a red dot, we caught some. There's another site over here called Coal Green, where we also caught some. And I'll say more about that later, because it's actually quite important to the whole story. But the sort of sites where we found them, there's Hertfordshire has quite a lot of chalk streams, and one of them is the River Mimram, which runs up through here. And lots of sites where green sandpipers were found along the Mimram. Gravel pit workings over here at Waterford. Saw our colouring birds there, a farm pond up here. And then down here, it's more into gravel workings and a few farm ponds. And the River Lee runs through here, which is not a chalk stream. And we've got very few records of sites with green sandpipers, just one down here. So compared with the lovely chalk stream of the Mimram, rather few on the River Lee. And so we've got this repertoire of sites that the birds were using at different times of year. And we could then work out when individual colouring birds were arriving in the area and leaving. And this is quite remarkable. So this is a slide of the first dates when I saw a particular colouring bird and the last date in each winter period. So the graph runs from June through to May. And so you see that individual birds are turning up in Hertfordshire in June, early June, peak in late June. Some of these are ones where I think they probably could have been in Hertfordshire, but I didn't manage to get to look at their legs. And then in terms of leaving, they're not really leaving. The peak of leaving is the end of April, early May. So these individual birds are around in that little patch of Hertfordshire for what it's 9 months of the year, which I find quite stunning, really. And the other thing we found is that and you'd expect this, I think, that the birds actually switched between different sorts of sites. So when they first came back in June, July, and through into the autumn, they were largely on sites with still water. So these would be gravel pits mainly, but the odd pond. And at that time of year, they actually need some water with a bare, muddy fringe that they can feed on. And so it depends a lot on what's been happening on the gravel pits as to whether the habitat's suitable. And then as you move into the autumn, more and more of the birds shift to the flowing water sites, which are essentially Lemsford Springs and the sites along the River Mimram. And so they're on those, and then there's a bit of shift back. And so the diet is almost certainly changing. They're probably feeding on chironomids and things through the summer, and then switching to other aquatic invertebrates through the winter. But that's a very clear pattern of change. But these are the same birds that are shifting their sites and their habitats over the course of the winter. And this just gives an idea of the repertoire of sites. So this is actually Coal Green, the site I mentioned where we caught a few birds, which was a landfill site, gravel workings. Here's some gravel workings. That's a typical sort of place where you'd find a green sandpiper through the summer, if there was water there. And here is Lemsford showing what it's like in a really cold winter, with everywhere else frozen up. But because the springs are feeding this and they're about 5 degrees C, whatever the weather, it stays as flowing water. So it then becomes quite a mecca for green sandpipers during the cold spells. There's a lot of parallels between this talk and Pete's, actually. So one of the first things we wanted to do was we were catching these birds at Lemsford, and I'd seen where they were going, but we didn't going during the day, but we didn't know where they were roosting and what was going on. And so back in the late 80s, we fitted only 5 birds, in fact, with standard old-fashioned radio tags. So these are things that go bleep, 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 and you rush around with an directional aerial and work out where the birds are and follow them that way. So that was the only sort of technology that was available in those days, nothing clever at all. And it turned out that the story was actually very simple. For all 5 birds, here's Lemsford, and they all roosted overnight on a gravel pit complex about 4 kilometres away. And so that's why we could catch these birds at first light. They were somewhere else overnight. And in fact, when we looked around and looked for droppings and pellets of green sandpipers, we think they're all roosting together on an island in these gravel pits. So that's where they roost, and they roost there most of the time. So with these radio tags on the bird and knowing where they were going, we were able to rig up activity monitors, again parallel to what Pete was saying. We got so good at this that we could monitor the activity of the birds for about 23 hours a day. So we knew what time they were going to leave Lemsford in the afternoon. We had one set of equipment, which in those days was actually a radio receiver and a chart recorder, and you could then measure the signal on the chart. So no data loggers in those days. We could see when they left Lemsford, take the equipment, rush it over to the gravel pit, set it up, leave it overnight, go along first thing in the morning and move it back. And so we got amazing information on the activities of the birds. And when they were roosting at the gravel pits, during the day, and they'd be at Lemsford, they would be about 80% of their time would be instead of time active, 80% of their time is active. And at night, they're only down to about 14%. So we concluded from that they just weren't feeding during the night. They're active during the day. And we think they're probably using sight a lot to forage, which might relate to the sort of habitat they're in. In midwinter, when it got really cold, a couple of the birds actually roosted at Lemsford, and this is when the gravel pit was so frozen that we think the island they're on probably wasn't safe. So during the day, they were 80% active, but in terms of the logging from the data loggers, they're about 40% active at night. Now, we don't know whether they were feeding at night. We think they could have been trying. We think they could have been so hard pressed that they were having to feed during the night as well as during the day. But unfortunately, we didn't have image intensifiers to see what they were doing, but they were far more active when they were at Lemsford. So during the course of our studies, we've had a few sightings and recoveries away from Lemsford. Now, unlike Pete and his Greenshanks, very few people actually see the legs of Green Sandpipers away from Lemsford. So we don't get many sightings away. But we had a surprisingly large number of resightings and recoveries that actually fit with the overall migration pattern. So a guy in Norway actually saw one of the colouring birds in April, so it would probably be breeding up that way. A Belgian ringer caught one in July, and one was found dead in France in August. But the one in Spain here is the most remarkable of the lot. So this was fairly recent, and this particular bird, we think it was a bird that wasn't going to winter in the UK. It was passing through Lemsford in the autumn and was going to carry on. And it was actually seen by Barry at Lemsford on 4 o'clock in the afternoon on August the 24th. And then we had a report from a bird watcher in Santander in Spain the next afternoon, and it was in Spain. So we think it just did an overnight flight down to Spain. So it's just remarkable how quickly these birds can move around. Right, so why is Lemsford so good for green sandpipers? Well, it has this shallow open water, as we say. It's open in cold weather conditions, so in midwinter it's important. And we can't stress enough that actually being an undisturbed site is really important. If it was open for ordinary walking and stuff, those birds certainly wouldn't be there. But the biggest factor, we think, is food, and it often is for distributions of birds. And these sandpipers are actually feeding on freshwater shrimp. How do we know that? Well, if you look in the bottom slide there, you can actually see a pellet here. And these green sandpipers feed a lot on these shrimps, and then every half an hour or so they bring up a pellet, and the pellet is pink. And it's quite interesting. I now live in Chichester, which is the home of Shipham's, and this looks just like Shipham's fish paste, really. I mean, it is remains of shrimp. When you look at it under a microscope, it's just shrimp, shrimp, shrimp. And this is really what's holding the birds at Lemsford. And a lot of the management of the site is now focused on maintaining these conditions. And so in the summer, the watercress grows and covers the whole lagoons. And if nothing else was done, the lagoons would not be open at all until probably end of September, October, before the watercress started dying back. But what happens now, and what's been worked out over the years in terms of the management of the site, is to rake up the cress in late summer into heaps. And here's a gang of volunteers doing it, all looking happy in their work, just pulling the cress back to create the open water. And we even get very famous volunteers helping. So David Ashmore came down in the 80s to plant an oak tree, in fact, but he didn't escape unscathed, and we got him raking some cress. We've got a photograph of him, which is fantastic, really. But this does more than just provide open water in late summer. The cress actually gets left on the lagoons to decay and break down. And freshwater shrimps are detritivores, so they feed on rotting vegetation. And so what happens is that the shrimps actually really have a high old time of it under these heaps of rotting watercress. And over the course of 2 or 3 months, those heaps will just completely disappear as the rotting vegetation gets eaten by the shrimps. And the shrimps are then in the lagoons, in the interstices of the gravel bed, ready for birds to come and feed on them. So this is the key thing that's happened about managing the site that we've gradually learned over the years. And there are plenty of other tasks going on the reserve of a large scale. The water depth in some areas can get quite deep. The water seems to dissolve some of the chalk bed on the crest bed, so you need topping up occasionally, so I had a digger in to do that. The willow trees around the edge need to be kept in check, because if the place gets too wooded, then the sandpipers won't be attracted. And the bank along that has these willows, this is what separates the clean spring water lagoons from the River Lee, which is flowing just beside, and the River Lee is anything but clean, so we need to keep the River Lee out. And of course, it's all good fun, so there's very entertaining the volunteers. And it's amazing how this is only a few acres, this site, and the number of birds it attracts and the interest it generates is just fantastic. So here's just a sample of the birds. So jack snipe and snipe recorded there, water rails regular, the kingfisher obviously. The snipe and jack snipe's quite interesting because the numbers actually have gone right down over the last few years, and I suspect this is something to do with the lack of suitability of the rest of the landscape around for these birds, because it tended only to come when it was very frozen conditions, and they would have been on farmland in the area, and I think that's what's happening there. We've actually had a wader fest, and Pete, you'll be pleased to know, we've actually now, last year, the first Greenshank recorded on the reserve. There's the Greenshank, common sandpiper, wood sandpiper's been there. This is a really interesting shot. So Greenshank in the front and green sandpiper behind there, beautifully posed. Quite a size difference. Okay, so if Lemsford Springs is so good, I've bigged it up over the last few slides, how wonderful. Why do these birds go to all these other places? It's quite fascinating, really. Well, obviously, when they first arrive in June, Lemsford probably doesn't look very suitable anyway, so they have to find some other freshwater, still water sites, probably the gravel pits. But the other thing that happens, which is quite remarkable, is that green sandpipers are territorial in winter. And here's a set of slides just to demonstrate this. So here's the slide I showed you earlier. These are green sandpipers in autumn, all sat together, all quite content on this, this track. Quite happy together, no disputing at all, go around in a gang, feed in a gang, all very happy. And then what happens is sometime in the autumn, it's like throwing a switch, and suddenly they start fighting and chasing each other around. And some marvellous pictures that Pete Finn has taken for us here of what's going on. And for those of you who aren't familiar with green sandpipers, here's the key look, the black underwing, the black and white wader really. The legs are slightly green, but you know, you could hardly describe it as a green bird. So they start off by flying around, chasing each other, calling loudly, facing up to each other, and sometimes having a big fight. And that happens every autumn. It happens at different times in the autumn. And here, we actually are thankful for Graham Appleton for publishing this for us on his Wader Tales blog, which is to be highly recommended if anybody's interested in waders. Lots of really interesting stories on there. But this is some stuff where I was actually watching the green sandpipers and doing some activity monitoring. And so we could see what actually went on. So the solid line here is the number of birds on the lagoons at Lemsford. So it's averaging about 8. And the timeline starts at the beginning of October, November, December through here. And so there are kind of 8 birds around on the lagoons every day then. And the dots here are the percentage of time they spent disputing. And so what I was doing there was actually for each period doing a half-hour watch where I was recording the activity of each bird every minute for half an hour. So it keeps you off the streets, I guess, but it's how you can get these behavioural things. And it's going through October, there we are, these birds are there, and no disputing at all. 1% or something, so the occasional little peep at each other, but actually all together, feeding together. And then bang, end of October, we start to get disputing. Lots of disputing, big disputing on that day. Much higher disputing that carried on right through into the winter. So you're then talking about 15% of their time disputing. But the thing that happens is that the 8 birds on the lagoon goes down to 4. And what's happened is they've established their individual territories. And from that point on, they know their territory. They do a bit of disputing. It usually happens on the boundary. The bird goes up to the boundary and its neighbour starts calling and going, oi, and then it moves back. And so it doesn't often involve a lot of disputing. Not sure what happened there, but there was obviously a lot going on in the half hour I was watching. But that's essentially the pattern. What happens, that happens each autumn. And the date when that's happened has varied from year to year. So it's been as early as September. And last year, it wasn't until December when Barry was saying that they suddenly started disputing again. And at the moment, they're all on their territories. And that's it. So what happens there is those 8 birds that have decided to spend the winter in that bit of Hertfordshire, only 4 of them are at Lemsford, so the other 4 have got to go to other sites. So that's where other sites become really important. So why should that happen? Well, I've never spent enough time to really be able to pin it down, but I can guess that what's going on is that the number of shrimps, the food, is gradually declining because every bird is feeding on shrimps at this stage. So the numbers of shrimps in the lagoons will be gradually declining in that period. The day length is getting shorter and it's getting colder. And it comes a point where the birds are starting to have trouble getting enough food for themselves and are trying then to claim individual patches. There's definitely a PhD in this if anybody's listening who wants to do one. The birds are there, you just need to watch them for long enough and measure the right things, and I think it would be an interesting story. Right, another interesting story, well, I think it's really interesting. So the number of birds at Lemsford Springs in the winter has varied a lot since it was a reserve in the early 1970s. So I pulled together all the data here, and so it's an issue reserve there. So maybe 5 green sandpipers on the lagoons. When we started our study, and one thing that got us involved, there were massive numbers. Suddenly there were 20 or something green sandpipers on the lagoons. So this is unprecedented. This is like got to be the top green sandpiper site in the whole country by a mile. A fantastic number of green sands. Then the numbers fell off on the lagoons, and we actually went through a period where we didn't have any. What was going on there? And then back up again. Right, what it turns out was going on was this period in the mid-80s, the site that I showed you right at the beginning called Coal Green was just amazing. It was a landfill site, a very old landfill site that had been very poorly regulated in its day. And the owners had a problem in that the leachate coming out of the landfill was polluting the River Lee in a big way. And as a lot of London's drinking water comes from the River Lee, they were into deep trouble. And their temporary solution was to dig a trench around the whole landfill. And this is about 100 acres, so it's a really big site. Dig a trench around it and then collect all the leachate water that's coming out the bottom and pump it back up to the top and spray it. I don't know who advised them on this, but it turned out that this was a mecca for birds. Another mecca, sorry. But so we had things like 30 green sandpipers, rough, green shank, red shank. We even ringed a corncrake there. And so it just shows what happens in an inland site if you just add water. Now, this happened to be quite nutrient-rich water, of course, because it was coming out of the lagoons, but it was fantastic. And sadly, that site then got destroyed because the company couldn't afford to carry on spraying water over the place, and it's now pony grazing and has no waders at all. But what happened here was large numbers of green sandpipers were being attracted, and they turned up at Leamington in midwinter when this place was frozen. It took about a decade for the numbers to fall, even though coal green had gone about here. And that, we think, is down to the birds' site fidelity. The individual colouring birds were still around, and with their annual survival rate about 85%, it took quite a long time for the local population to fall back. And then we went through a period where there were no gravel pits at all around, and we had no birds. And then we got better at managing Lemsford in the autumn, and now there's a new gravel pit site nearby, and so the birds are back up again. But it shows the interconnection between all these different habitats. Okay, where do our birds go to breed, and how do they get there? So this is the next chapter in the story. This is back to the recovery map from the BTO Migration Atlas, which went up to 97. So just like Pete, we've used various tags. Now I call these things archival tags. These are tags that collect data on either light levels or GPS fixes for the birds, and they store them on the tag. And then you have to retrieve the tag from the bird to collect the data. When we first started in 2015, the only ones available were these light level ones, which are the ones Pete used on his Greenshanks. And what they do is measure the daylight every 5 minutes, and from that you can induce the time of midday and sunrise and sunset time, and from that you can calculate the latitude and longitude. And they're quite approximate, but they're pretty damn good for tracking birds on a world scale. Very quickly after we used a few of those, GPS tags became available. So these take GPS fixes and store them, and then you get the tag back and download them. Our first tags would only do 10 GPS fixes. The tags that we've been using now will do 150. So technology is moving on all the time. And green sandpipers only weigh about 80 grams, so we can only really put very small tags on. And so these were around a gram really for the tags. And they were fitted with harnesses. So lots of regulation about how you use harnesses, but these are elasticated harnesses which actually go around the thigh of the bird, and the tag sits on the back. And here's one of our tag birds. We had to be extremely careful about what we're doing because, as I said, these birds can be seen from the hides the whole time. So we needed them to look okay and be behaving okay, and we should have done, should do that anyway. And here's one of our tag birds, and you can just see the aerial sticking out the back there, and a slight lump on its back. I did lots of work on looking at potential effects of tags on birds. So I think when you do tag birds, particularly putting larger tags on them, you have a responsibility for making sure they're not doing anything. And in terms of survival, we had no measurable effect at all. But in all these watches that I did on birds, these half-hour watches, I actually had tagged birds and untagged birds in the sample, and was able to look at the percent time feeding. And the black dots here are half-hour watches for untagged birds, and the red dots are tagged birds. And there was no difference at all in the feeding rate. And also looked at the rate that they were preening, because you'd expect birds with tags to preen them a bit more. And there is a very small effect. This hump here is related to the fact that we were tagging birds in this time. So this is winter here. So we were tagging new birds here. But a very small effect on rate of preening, but not much at all, really. So that's really reassuring. And what did it show us? Well, amazing results, really. So we've so far have 10 tracks. We have tags on 2 birds at the moment, which will be heading off in April and get more, and then that will be our study on this. And they're going to Norway, Sweden and Finland. The big circle here is the one tag we got back from a bird with a light level geolocator, and the mean position is in here, but this is the range of fixes. They're much less precise than the GPS ones. And the green dot here is where we actually tagged the same birds in 2 breeding seasons. So essentially, our birds that are wintering in Hertfordshire are popping over to Scandinavia to breed. And how do they get there? Well, they get there very quickly. So this is just 2 examples. And these were tags that were doing GPS fixes every 2 days. But it now turns out that they actually do 1 flight across the North Sea, land the other side, and then move up through Scandinavia to their breeding area in the next 2 or 3 days. So they get there in about 4 days from Lemsford to breeding. They leave at the end of April, and they're on their breeding grounds in a few days. And on the way back, they take a bit longer, but still not much. So these birds are on their breeding areas until mid-June, and these 2 were back in Hertfordshire on June 21st. So it's like about 10 days to come back. So that's their year, really. They've in Hertfordshire in the winter, end of April, pop over to Scandinavia, 1 or 2 months in Scandinavia, pop back to Hertfordshire. That's it. So the key points, they leave mid to late April, and they move very quickly to the breeding areas. So we've got this 1 overnight flight. We've got a couple of GPS locations mid-flight. One of them was flying at sea level, the other was at about 300 meters. So we can't really tell much from that. We've got some limited evidence that they're extremely faithful to their breeding site. So we know they're extremely faithful to their wintering site, and I'll show you this in a minute. They stay in the breeding area for 1 or 2 months, and like Pete, we under license had feather samples to be able to sex our tagged birds, and the females stay for 1 month and the males stay for 2, which matches the idea that the females leave the males to look after the chicks once they've hatched. They come back more slowly to Hertfordshire, so most of their year is spent in Hertfordshire. What am I doing? Good. So just an example. So this white on green is probably the most observed green sandpiper in the world, we reckon. A few thousand observations of this particular bird. There it is. Right, when we first tagged it, so here's a Google map of Lemsford Springs. And here's the A1M I told you about, and here's built up Wellingham City. And we tested the tag in Barry Trevis's garden, which is up there. There's a green dot. And then we tagged the bird, and there it was on one of the lagoons, what we call the South Lagoon, is a lagoon in Lemsford Springs. And that just shows you the accuracy of these GPS locations. It's spot on, it's absolutely brilliant. So the other thing green sandpipers do in April and late March, and I've not said much about molt because I don't have time, and there's a whole story about the molt, but they molt into their breeding plumage. And so here is white on green in winter, down in the bottom right here, very drab looking head patterns, and few spotting on the wings, but very uniform on the back. So during that 6 weeks at the end of winter, they turn themselves into these things, fantastic plumage. Could easily be confused with a wood sandpiper, there's so much spotting on it. And they start doing quite a lot of displaying. So we've had them displaying at Lemsford Springs. We've even had them perching in the trees. So you could see where people at one stage thought green sandpipers might breed in southern Britain. They don't, but they start doing that sort of behaviour very early on. So it's molted. And here it is en route to its breeding grounds. And we got the location right on the coast of southern Norway. And we thought, blimey, is this a green sandpiper using saltwater habitats? This is unusual. Anyway, blew up the picture a bit from Google Maps, and no, it wasn't. It was actually on a pool about 100 meters inland from the coast. And the fix is amazing. It's on the edge of the pool. It's not in the middle. You know, it's just brilliant. So it then moves up to its breeding area. This is a map of the sort of habitat. It's not the actual breeding area. We were planning a trip to go and see some of our sandpipers on the breeding grounds in Sweden before COVID arrived, so that's been put on hold, which we might still do it. But here's the breeding site here, and those dots, we think that was the actual nest of that bird. You see the scale there, the red line on the bottom left is 200 meters, so that circle's about 100 meters. So we think that was the actual tree in which it nested. and the odd record around the edge of a lake and stuff. So, yeah, really fantastic accuracy of those locations. And then a few weeks later, here we are back in Hertfordshire, and this is on the local gravel pit, and lots of locations around the pools there. So that white on green was at Lemsford, shot off to Norway, bred, came back, was on the gravel pit by the end of June. I said there was some evidence of site fidelity. We've got one bird where we had tags on it in 2 breeding seasons, 2015 and 19, so that's 4 years apart. The 2015 tag was one of these 10 location ones, so we were a bit sparing with how many fixes we could do. They're all programmed, so we had it doing a fix every 5 days, and that's where it bred, the yellow circle. 2019, we have a tag where it could do 150 fixes, and the nest site was in here. So 2 years breeding site, locations about 100 meters apart. So this bird at least, forgive all the green lines on there, they're nothing to do with this. But this bird in particular nested within 100 meters of where it was 4 years previously. So it's amazing what these birds are doing. Last slide here, the longevity record. So there's a bit of confusion on the BTO website as to which species is the longest lived. But this one is still at Lemsford. It's there at the moment. If it goes off to breed and comes back again, it will definitely break the record. It's 11 years and 12 months and counting. Well over 1,000 sightings of this individual bird. So it's amazing, really, that it's so long lived. So we have quite a bit of unfinished business on survival rates. I showed you the slide of the initial survival rate estimates. We're going to have so much more data that we can really do a much better job on it, and that's on the list to do after we've written up the where they go to breed. So what do we conclude? Well, green sandpipers are just remarkable little birds. I've just shown you some of the things they get up to. It really is quite remarkable that they can exist in our landscape and thrive, really. There's no evidence that numbers are going down. I think the more general conclusion from it is how they're so dependent on a variety of wetlands in the landscape. And I've wondered for a long time why there are very few green sandpipers in large parts of, say, Sussex and Hampshire, which have chalk streams, but don't seem to have that many green sandpipers wintering. They have some on passage, but not wintering. And I think it's this repertoire of different sites that they can go through right through the year that's really important. And so now we can manage Lemsford to give them some habitat in early autumn, late summer. But those chalk streams and the Mimram, the chalk stream that they use a lot, is under great threat. So I had a period of a year or two when there's no flow at all because of over abstraction by the water companies. And that's an ongoing saga trying to improve the conditions. But you can see that just adding water to some of these lowland landscapes could result in all sorts of interesting species and wonderful changes. So I'm happy to take questions. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ken. I've got a couple of questions in. We'll run through those quite quickly before I hand over Alan to close us out. So the first one I got was managing the site. Looks like it's a lot of work. Rather than raking, could you maybe let a herd of cows in or something?
I don't know how you do that without destroying the bed.
It looked to me like you were having a load of fun there anyway. So
it's good fun. It's a lot of work. No, I don't think cattle would do it. They'd smash up the. So you've got these crest beds have a gravel base, which is over chalk and sometimes a bit of clay. And so if you put cattle in there, they just destroy it.
So a load of folk with wellies and rakes does the trick.
They poo in it, which wouldn't be very good for the water quality in the invertebrates.
Excellent. Next one is, what do the males do exactly when they stay to look after the chicks on the breeding grounds?
Well, if they're like most waders, their main duty is to be sentinels. So they're looking out for predators and warning the chicks when to hide. And they do a lot of that. And they do actually lead them to places where there's food. That's the usual story. So I don't know for greensands because I've never seen them in the breeding grounds. I've heard them flying over in boreal forest, but I've never actually got to see them doing it. But my guess is they lead them to the wetland places with the food, and then they'll be on duty looking out for any predators and warning the chicks to take cover.
Okay.
The chicks feed themselves.
Lovely. And I'm going to indulge and take the final question here from Mark Maladieu, which is food must be plentiful in Scandinavia in June. So why do the females leave so quickly?
Good question.
Hertfordshire, surely. That's the answer.
Because Hertfordshire is such a wonderful place and they love the nightlife. I don't know.
It's intriguing, isn't it? You would think there'd be plenty for them.
We've answered some of the questions. Yeah.
Lovely. And the concluding comment coming through there is Bob Gomes. Oh, lovely to hear from you, Bob. Just saying, Pete and Ken, thank you for two very interesting and informative talks. Indeed.